The shift was almost over when Officer Daniel Reeves saw it, a lone figure sitting perfectly still on the edge of the sidewalk, just beyond the reach of the flickering streetlight. At first, he thought it was a trick of shadows, just another pile of garbage left on the curb. But as he rolled past in his patrol car, the shape moved ever so slightly, a slow tilt of the head, dark eyes reflecting the dull glow of the city around it. A dog. Daniel's foot eased off the gas as his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The German Shepherd was thin, its ribs pressing against a dull, dirt-matted coat. It didn't move, didn't even flinch as the car idled a few feet away. Just sat there staring, watching, waiting. Something about it felt wrong. Stray dogs were nothing new in this part of town. Greenridge wasn't exactly a dangerous city, but like any place, it had its forgotten corners. Daniel had seen his fair share of abandoned pets left to fend for themselves. Most of them were skittish, darting away the moment a human got too close. But this one, it wasn't running. It wasn't scared. It was waiting. A cold weight settled in Daniel's chest as he pulled over and stepped out, boots crunching against the cracked pavement. The air was thick with the lingering scent of rain, the distant hum of traffic blending with the occasional burst of laughter from a bar down the street. He crouched low, keeping his voice steady. "Hey there, buddy. What are you doing out here?" The dog didn't move. Daniel could see the details now. The cuts along its legs, the torn edge of an ear, the way its paws curled slightly inward as if it had spent too long standing in one place. And then there was the collar. Worn leather, rusted metal, a tag that had once gleamed but was now dulled with age and grime. Daniel's pulse ticked up as he slowly reached out. His fingers brushed the tag, wiping away the dirt. The metal was cold under his touch, and for a moment, he thought he had misread it. Then he saw the name, and his breath hitched. Ranger. His throat tightened as an old memory slammed into him like a freight train. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. 3 years. 3 whole years since that night. The worst night of his career. The night a routine drug bust turned into chaos. The night his K-9 partner, Ranger, had gone missing. The night Daniel had been forced to accept the unbearable truth. Ranger was gone. Except now here he was, alive, barely breathing, barely standing. But here, Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay steady. His mind raced with questions, with possibilities. But one thing was clear. Someone had taken Ranger. Someone had kept him, hurt him, and then let him go. But why? And more importantly, what if whoever had him was still out there? As Daniel gently ran his hand over Ranger's head, feeling the ridges of scars hidden beneath his fur, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. The city never truly slept, but in the early hours of the morning, it took on a different kind of stillness. The usual chaos of sirens, honking cars, and hurried footsteps had faded into a low hum, leaving only the occasional gust of wind rattling the street signs. Officer Daniel Reeves remained crouched in front of the battered German Shepherd, his fingers still resting against the rusted metal tag. His mind was running 100 miles an hour, but one thought kept repeating, louder than the rest. Oh, 3 years. That's how long it had been since Ranger disappeared, since the mission had gone south, since the backup never came, since he had been left standing alone in the alley, calling out his partner's name until his voice cracked. Since he had failed. He had searched, fought, refused to believe it at first. But weeks passed, then months, and eventually, he had to let go. But now here Ranger was, thin, scarred, but alive. Daniel clenched his jaw, pushing down the rising wave of guilt that threatened to overtake him. The dog had been his responsibility, his partner, and somehow, someone had taken him. The question was who, and maybe even more importantly, why. Ranger hadn't just been some pet. He was a trained K-9, one of the best in the department. He could track a suspect through a mile of city streets, detect narcotics with pinpoint accuracy, take down a grown man twice his size. This wasn't a case of a lost dog finding his way home. Someone had kept him. Someone had done something to him. And now, for some reason, they had let him go. Daniel slowly exhaled, shifting his weight as he glanced around the deserted street. Something about this felt off. If Ranger had just escaped from wherever he had been held, why had he ended up here? And why was he waiting? As if he had known Daniel would come. A prickle of unease crawled up the back of Daniel's neck, but he pushed it aside. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a protein bar he had grabbed at the start of his shift. Carefully, he unwrapped it and extended it toward Ranger. The shepherd's nose twitched. His sunken eyes locked onto Daniel's hand. For the first time since Daniel had stepped out of the patrol car, Ranger moved. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned forward and took the piece of food, chewing with mechanical efficiency. His body trembled from the effort of just standing, but there was still something there, some part of him that hadn't been completely broken. That was enough for Daniel. Gently, he ran his hand over Ranger's fur, feeling every ridge of his protruding ribs, every scar that hadn't been there before. His gut tightened as he realized something else. Some of these weren't just from neglect. They were from abuse. Daniel's jaw locked. Someone had hurt him. Someone had taken his partner, a dog who would have died for him, and put him through hell. And Daniel was going to find out who. He stood, his decision already made. He wasn't leaving Ranger out here. He wasn't taking him to some overworked shelter or some vet who would ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. He was taking him home. Carefully, he reached down, scooping his arms under Ranger's frail body. The shepherd let out a faint whimper of protest, but didn't struggle. His body was too weak, his energy too drained. As Daniel carried him to the patrol car, a new thought settled into his mind, one that refused to let go. If Ranger had been missing for 3 years, why did he come back now? And more importantly, who was watching? Daniel kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near the radio as he guided the patrol car through the quiet streets. Ranger lay curled up in the passenger seat, his breathing slow but steady, the rise and fall of his chest barely visible under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. He looked so much smaller than Daniel remembered, so much weaker. 3 years ago, Ranger had been a force to be reckoned with, sharp, strong, and unshakable. Now he looked like a ghost of the partner Daniel had lost. The cuts along his body weren't just from living on the streets. Some were old, healed badly. Others were fresher. Someone had kept him. Someone had hurt him. And now, for some reason, they had let him go. Daniel's fingers tapped absently against the wheel as he turned onto his street. His house was small, nothing fancy, but it was quiet, isolated enough that no one could bother him if he didn't want to be found. Tonight, that suited him just fine. The thought had barely settled before something caught his attention. His porch light was off. Daniel frowned. He always left it on, out of habit, out of caution. But now, the entire front of his house was cloaked in darkness. His grip tightened on the wheel. Someone had been here. His gut told him to keep driving, to call it in, to let someone else check it out. But Ranger let out a low whine beside him, barely audible, but enough to break through Daniel's thoughts. He wasn't running from this. Carefully, he pulled into the driveway, his movement slow, controlled. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning the street. No unfamiliar cars. No figures lingering in the shadows. Just the quiet. Too quiet. Daniel reached for his sidearm before stepping out of the car. The night air was crisp, but his skin was already burning with unease. His senses were sharp, honed from years on the force, and right now, everything was telling him that something was off. He stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under his weight. He reached for the doorknob, pausing just long enough to listen. Nothing. With one smooth motion, he pushed the door open, his weapon drawn. The living room was exactly how he had left it, except for one thing. On the center of his coffee table, placed deliberately where he couldn't miss it, was a single manila envelope. Daniel's pulse kicked up. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't random. Someone had been inside. His first instinct was to check the rest of the house, but Ranger let out another low whine from the passenger seat, a reminder that the dog had been through enough for one night. Daniel exhaled sharply, holstering his weapon. He turned back to the car, opening the passenger door. "Come on, buddy. Let's get you inside." Ranger hesitated but then slowly climbed out, his legs stiff, his body still weak from whatever hell he had endured. Daniel kept a steadying hand on his back as they made their way up the porch steps. Once inside, he locked the door behind them. Only then did he turn back to the envelope. It was unmarked. No name, no return address. Just thick, yellowed paper, folded neatly, almost too carefully. Daniel reached for it, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He had spent years dealing with evidence, with classified documents, with the kind of files that carried secrets too heavy to say out loud. But something about this, something about the way it had been placed in his home, waiting for him, felt personal. He slid his thumb under the flap, raking the seal. Inside were three things: a photograph, a handwritten note, and a key. Daniel's breath caught as he pulled out the photo. It was Ranger, but not the Ranger he had known. This was recent, taken within the last few months. The dog was inside a cage, his eyes hollow, his body even thinner than it was now. And in the background, just barely visible, was the blurred shape of a man standing in the shadows. Daniel flipped to the note, his fingers shaking slightly. The handwriting was sharp, almost aggressive. 3 words. You weren't supposed to. Daniel swallowed hard. Weren't supposed to what? Find Ranger. Take him home. Look for whoever had done this. His mind reeled as he turned to the last object in the envelope. The key was small, old. The storage unit? A locker? A house? Daniel didn't know. But one thing was crystal clear. This wasn't over. Whoever had taken Ranger wasn't done with him. And now, they were coming for Daniel too. The clock on the wall read 2:37 a.m. But sleep wasn't coming tonight. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photograph of Ranger, the key, and the note that had been left in his house. You weren't supposed to. The word sat heavy in his mind. Whoever had taken Ranger hadn't just abandoned him. They had been watching. And somehow, they knew Daniel would find him. His gut twisted. He had worked enough cases to recognize a message when he saw one. This wasn't over. It was a warning. Ranger let out a slow breath from where he lay on a folded blanket near the couch. His ears twitched, but his eyes stayed closed, exhausted beyond belief. Daniel wished he could rest as easily. He needed answers, and there was only one place to start. The key. Daniel picked it up, turning it over in his hand. There was nothing distinctive about it, just a dull, brass-colored key with a small number etched into the side. 415. A locker. A storage unit. A mailbox. His mind spun through possibilities, but one thought cut through the noise. Whoever left this broke into his house. His stomach clenched. His gun was still holstered at his hip, but he reached for it instinctively, pressing his palm against the grip. Had they been watching him the whole time? Were they still out there? His gut told him yes. He stood and walked toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the street outside. Nothing, but that didn't mean much. Daniel let the curtain fall back into place. He needed to move. Sitting here wasn't going to get him anywhere. His phone vibrated on the table. Unknown number. His pulse spiked. For a second, he considered letting it go to voicemail, but instinct took over, and he answered. He didn't say anything, just waited. Silence on the other end. And then a low, distorted voice crackled through the speaker. You shouldn't have taken him. Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. Who is this? His voice was calm, but his heart was hammering. You weren't supposed to find him. Daniel's jaw clenched. Yeah, too bad. He's mine. A pause. Then the voice dropped lower. Amused. Not anymore. The line went dead. Daniel's blood turned to ice. For a long moment, he just stood there, phone still clutched in his hand. Ranger stirred, lifting his head slightly, his tired eyes locking onto Daniel's. Someone wanted his dog back. Someone who had gone through a lot of trouble to make him disappear in the first place. And now they were coming for him. The search for answers. Daniel pulled into the Greenridge storage facility just before sunrise. It was the only place nearby with locker numbers in the 400s, and something in his gut told him he was on the right track. Ranger, still weak, lay curled up in the passenger seat. Daniel had debated leaving him at home, but there was no way in hell he was letting him out of his sight. He stepped out of the car, keeping his shoulders loose, but his senses sharp. The storage facility was eerily quiet at this hour. The metal units stretched down both sides of a narrow, dimly lit corridor. A single overhead light flickered, casting long shadows on the pavement. Daniel moved toward Unit 415, gripping the key tightly in his palm. The lock clicked open with ease. He braced himself, then pulled the door up. The inside was almost empty. Almost. A single wooden crate sat against the far wall, marked with a symbol Daniel didn't recognize. The edges of the crate were worn, the wood slightly splintered. It had been here a while. Daniel stepped inside cautiously, kneeling down beside the crate. He reached for the lid, hesitated for half a second, then pried it open. Inside files, dozens of them, each one marked with a name and a photo. And the first one on top, Ranger. Daniel's breath caught. He flipped it open, his pulse hammering. Inside was detailed documentation, medical reports, training logs, dates and locations. But not just from when Ranger was with the Force. After. Daniel's hands shook as he turned the pages. Whoever had taken Ranger kept records. And not just of him. Daniel grabbed another file at random. A Labrador mix, reported missing 2 years ago. Another, a Belgian Malinois, last seen on a military base. These weren't just stolen dogs. They had been taken for a reason. Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't a case of abuse or neglect. This was organized. His stomach turned as he reached the last page of Ranger's file. There was a single sentence written in bold black ink. Transferred to Phase 2. Daniel's hands curled into fists. Whatever this operation was, whoever had taken Ranger, this wasn't random. And if Phase 2 meant what he thought it did, Ranger wasn't the only dog they wanted. And now, they knew Daniel was looking for them. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the last page of Ranger's file. Transferred to Phase 2. His mind raced, connecting pieces that still didn't quite fit. Ranger had been taken, kept used, but for what? And now they knew Daniel had him. Ranger let out a low whine from behind him, his weak body shifting in the passenger seat. He was getting restless, sensing the tension thickening in the air. Daniel clenched his jaw and shoved the files back into the crate. He needed to get out of here. Now, he stood, glancing toward the entrance of the storage unit, and that's when he heard it. A soft click. His instincts kicked in a second too late. The lights cut out. The storage facility was suddenly pitch black, swallowing everything in an eerie silence. Daniel barely had time to move before bang. Something slammed against the metal unit next to him, the force sending a vibration through the walls. Daniel whipped around, gun drawn, his breathing controlled, steady. But there was nothing. Another sound, a sharp inhale, like someone shifting just out of sight. They weren't alone. Daniel's grip tightened around his gun. Whoever had broken into his house, left that key, watched him. They were here. He didn't wait. Lunging forward, he grabbed the crate and sprinted toward the car. He barely made it 3 steps before a dark figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured, moving fast. Daniel pivoted, swinging the crate like a weapon. It connected hard against the attacker's ribs, sending them stumbling backward with a grunt of pain. But there was more than one. A second figure charged from his right. Daniel barely dodged, as something sharp whizzed past his ear, a knife. They weren't just trying to scare him. They were trying to take him out. Daniel fired a warning shot, the gun's roar cutting through the air like a whip. The figures scattered, but he knew they wouldn't stay gone for long. Wasting no time, he sprinted toward his car, yanking open the door. "Hold on, buddy," he muttered, throwing the crate onto the back seat and peeling out of the storage lot, tires screeching against the pavement. In the rearview mirror, he saw them. 2 shadowy figures, standing perfectly still in the entrance of the storage facility, watching him leave. Not chasing, not attacking, just watching. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Daniel didn't stop driving until he was sure he wasn't being followed. The city blurred past him in streaks of amber streetlights and empty roads. His heart was still hammering, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Ranger lay curled in the passenger seat, his ribs rising and falling with steady but labored breaths. The dog was exhausted, but his ears twitched, his body tense. Even in his weakened state, he knew something was wrong. Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel tighter as he ran through the facts. Someone had taken Ranger 3 years ago. They had kept detailed records, not just on him, but on other missing dogs. They had been watching. They had let Ranger go, but why? And now, they had come after Daniel. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The storage facility was far behind him, but the figures standing in the shadows still haunted his mind. They hadn't run, hadn't chased. They had just watched, like they already knew what his next move would be. Daniel clenched his jaw. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought he'd back off. They were wrong. Breaking the code, Daniel pulled into his driveway, just as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The tension in his chest hadn't faded, but the exhaustion was creeping in. He needed help, and there was only one person he trusted to go down this rabbit hole with him. Detective Sarah Martinez. Daniel grabbed his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and hit call. It rang twice before a groggy but sharp voice answered. "Reeves, do you have any idea what time it is?" "Yeah," Daniel said. His voice clipped. "I need you to get over here. Now." A pause. Then Sarah sighed. "How bad is it?" "Bad. I'm on my way." The call ended, and Daniel turned back to Ranger, who was watching him, his amber eyes still sharp despite his exhaustion. "You good, buddy?" Daniel murmured. Ranger let out a soft exhale, shifting slightly, but never looking away. Daniel reached over, running a hand along the dog's head. "We're going to figure this out." He just had no idea what they were walking into. Unraveling the truth, Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, still in sweatpants, a hoodie, and a look that said she wasn't in the mood for nonsense. "You better have coffee," she muttered, stepping inside. Daniel gestured to the pot already brewing. "You're going to need it." Sarah arched an eyebrow, but said nothing as she poured herself a cup and sat at the kitchen table. "All right, talk." Daniel pulled out the file from the storage unit, spreading the contents across the table. 3 years ago, Ranger disappeared. I thought he was gone for good. He tapped the first page, but someone took him. Sarah frowned, flipping through the documents. "These are medical reports? Training logs?" Her eyes narrowed. "These aren't from the police department. Who the hell had access to this?" "That's what I need to find out." She picked up one of the other files. "It's not just him. Look at this. There are dozens of dogs in here. Military, police, even some high-end personal protection, K9S. She exhaled sharply. "This is organized, Reeves. This isn't just some underground fighting ring. This is bigger." Daniel already knew that, but Sarah wasn't finished. She lifted one of the reports, pointing at a specific name at the bottom of the page. The name of the overseeing medical examiner. Daniel's stomach dropped. He knew that name. Dr. Alan Grayson, the head veterinarian for the Green Ridge K9 unit, and the same man who had signed off on Ranger's initial police training records. Daniel's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just some faceless organization. This wasn't just random. This was someone they knew. Sarah's expression darkened. "You don't think?" "I do," Daniel said, his voice cold. Dr. Grayson had been with the force for over a decade. He had access to every police and military working dog in the system, and he had direct access to Ranger before he disappeared. Daniel's mind reeled. Had Grayson been selling trained K9S to the highest bidder? Was this about money? Illegal training? Something worse? Sarah exhaled. "If we're right about this, we can't just walk in and accuse him. We need proof." Daniel nodded slowly. His fingers brushed against the storage locker key still sitting on the table. "We get the proof," he said, voice steady. "And then we take him down." The plan. Daniel grabbed his jacket, his mind already racing. Grayson's clinic opens in 2 hours. If he's involved, he'll be covering his tracks the second he realizes someone's onto him. Sarah finished her coffee and stood. "So, what's the plan?" Daniel looked down at Ranger. The dog lifted his head slightly, his body still weak but his eyes unwavering. "We pay Grayson a visit," Daniel said. Sarah smirked. Now that's more like it. But deep down, Daniel knew this wasn't going to be simple. They were about to walk straight into the fire. And whoever was behind this, they were waiting for him. The morning air was crisp as Daniel and Sarah sat parked across the street from Grayson Veterinary Clinic. From the outside, it looked like any other small-town animal hospital. Clean windows, a neatly painted sign, a few cars in the lot. But Daniel knew better. This place wasn't just a vet's office. It was the center of something bigger. Sarah adjusted the holster beneath her jacket. So we go in, act normal, ask questions. Daniel shook his head. No. We go in like we know everything. Grayson's not going to admit a damn thing unless we force his hand. Sarah's eyes flicked toward Ranger in the back seat. The dog was watching the clinic, ears perked slightly despite his exhaustion. He remembered this place, which meant Daniel was right. Grayson was involved. Daniel opened the door. Let's move. They stepped inside, the scent of antiseptic and animal fur thick in the air. A receptionist sat at the front desk, barely glancing up. Daniel didn't waste time. We need to see Dr. Grayson. Now. The woman hesitated. Do you have an appointment? Now. His tone left no room for argument. She swallowed hard, picked up the phone and dialed. Dr. Grayson? There are some officers here to see you. A pause. Then send them back. The office was too neat, too sterile. Dr. Alan Grayson sat behind his desk, his graying hair combed perfectly, his suit crisp despite the early hour. He looked up with a measured smile. Officers, what can I do for you? Daniel stepped forward, dropping the file from the storage unit onto Grayson's desk. Recognize this. For a split second, so quick Daniel almost missed it, Grayson's expression faltered. Then he leaned back, sighing. I was wondering when you'd come knocking. Sarah narrowed her eyes. So you're not even going to pretend you don't know. Grayson folded his hands. No point. You wouldn't be here if you didn't already know the truth. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then start talking. Grayson's smile never wavered. I run a business, Officer Reeves. A profitable one. Do you have any idea how much a fully trained K-9 is worth overseas? The right buyer will pay more than you make in a year. Sarah's face hardened. You were selling them. Grayson shrugged. Not just selling. Training. Reprogramming. A K-9 like Ranger. Perfect for black market security. Private militaries. Even organized crime. Daniel's blood ran cold. What did you do to him? Grayson exhaled. Nothing that can't be undone. But he wasn't supposed to come back. His eyes flicked past them. And Daniel knew. It was a trap. The clinic doors locked with a click. Then footsteps. They weren't alone. The sound of the clinic doors locking sent a sharp chill down Daniel's spine. His hand instinctively moved toward his holster. But Grayson only smiled, calm and composed. Now, Officer Reeves, the vet said smoothly. You've come all this way. Wouldn't you rather hear the full story before making any rash decisions? Sarah shifted slightly beside Daniel, angling herself just enough to keep one hand near her weapon. She was tense, but controlled, waiting for the right moment. Ranger, still weak but alert, let out a low, warning growl from where he sat by the door. His ears twitched at the sound of footsteps approaching from behind the exam rooms. They weren't alone. Daniel held his ground, his jaw tight. You think locking us in is going to stop us from taking you down? Grayson chuckled, tapping his fingers against the desk. I think you don't understand what you've stepped into. The door behind Grayson creaked open. A man in a suit entered, his posture rigid, his eyes cold. He wasn't just some hired muscle. Daniel recognized the type. Ex-military. Dangerous. The man glanced at Grayson. Is this going to be a problem? Grayson exhaled. It doesn't have to be. Daniel's hand clenched into a fist. You've been running this operation for years. Stealing trained K-9s, reprogramming them, selling them off to the highest bidder. You really think you're just going to walk away from this? Grayson leaned back, unbothered. Walk away? No. I'll adapt. That's what survivors do. His eyes flicked to Ranger. That's what he did. Daniel's chest tightened. But before he could speak, the man in the suit moved. Fast. Too fast. In one motion, he reached for his waistband, but Daniel was already moving. Gun drawn. Finger on the trigger. Don't. The room froze. Sarah had drawn too. Her aim locked on the man's chest. For a second, everything hung in tense silence. Then Ranger snarled. The German shepherd, weak as he was, lunged. He wasn't at full strength, but he didn't need to be. His instincts took over, his teeth snapping inches from the man's leg. It was enough to break the moment. Daniel fired. The bullet slammed into the wall, just as the man dove for cover. Sarah moved next, kicking the desk forward, sending Grayson stumbling back with a curse. Chaos erupted. Daniel grabbed the file from Grayson's desk and shoved it under his arm. Time to go. Sarah was already moving, grabbing Ranger by the collar and guiding him toward the door. The lock. They needed to break the lock. Daniel fired twice, shattering the mechanism, and kicked the door open just as footsteps pounded toward them from down the hall. They didn't look back. They escaped the moment they burst into the parking lot. Daniel shoved the file into Sarah's hands. Get in the car. Now. Sarah didn't argue. She threw open the passenger door, guiding Ranger inside as Daniel scanned the lot. Grayson wouldn't chase them himself. He wasn't that kind of man. But the men working for him, they wouldn't let this go. Daniel yanked the driver's door open, but before he could climb in, tires screeched. A black SUV roared into the lot, cutting off the exit. Daniel's got twisted. The same SUV from before, the one that had been watching. The door started to open. Daniel didn't wait. He floored it. The tire spun against the pavement before catching, the patrol car slamming into the side of the SUV, just enough to throw them off balance. Then they were moving, racing down the road. Sarah twisted in her seat, gun still in her hand. They're following. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. They won't for long. He took a sharp turn, cutting through side streets, pushing the car to its limit. He had one advantage. He knew these roads better than they did, but they had more men, more resources, and they weren't just trying to kill him. They wanted Ranger back. Sarah kept her eyes on the mirror. We need backup. Daniel grabbed his radio with one hand. Dispatch, this is Officer Reeves. I'm being pursued by unknown hostiles, armed and dangerous. Request immediate units at my location. A crackle of static. Then copy that, Reeves. Units en route. The chase wasn't over. But now they had backup coming. Daniel's eyes flicked to Ranger in the rearview mirror. The dog was curled up but awake, watching him, his breathing steady despite everything. He had survived hell to get back to Daniel, and Daniel wasn't going to lose him again. Not now. Not ever. The chase ended outside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The moment Daniel saw the flashing blue and red lights up ahead, he knew it was over. The black SUV behind them screeched to a halt, its tires spinning against the pavement. Doors flung open, but before anyone could make a move, half a dozen patrol cars surrounded them, officers pouring out with weapons drawn. Hands where we can see them. Now. The men inside the SUV hesitated, just for a second. Then, one by one, they stepped out, their hands raised. Daniel exhaled, his pulse finally slowing. They had made it. Sarah got out of the car first, keeping her gun trained on the men. Daniel followed, his eyes still sharp, still searching. But there was no sign of Grayson. Just as he suspected, that coward had never planned to get his hands dirty himself. Get them in custody, Daniel ordered as the officers moved in, cuffing the men one by one. Then he turned back to his patrol car, where Ranger was watching everything unfold from the back seat. His amber eyes locked onto Daniel's, and for the first time, they weren't filled with fear. They were filled with understanding. He was home. 1 week later, the morning sun cast long golden streaks across Daniel's backyard. The air was still, peaceful, the first real moment of quiet he had felt in a long time. Ranger lay on the wooden porch beside him, his body stronger now, his fur cleaner. He still had scars, but they no longer defined him. Sarah had stopped by earlier with an update. The men from the SUV were talking. Names, locations, everything they needed to take down the rest of the operation. Grayson had vanished for now, but Daniel knew it was only a matter of time. Men like him always thought they were untouchable. They never were. Daniel reached down, running his hand over Ranger's head. "We did it, buddy." Ranger's tail thumped lightly against the porch. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel felt whole again. He had lost Ranger once. He wasn't going to lose him again. No matter what came next, they would face it together. Because at the end of the day, that's what partners do.